All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Line Your Own Pockets. Had a great episode last week where we talked to Marsten, who was the creator of Real Test and a market wizard. And it was a great conversation about systematic trading again from a master, but also one thing that stood out a lot to me and Dave was just the idea of reinventing yourself as a trader. We talked about Marston's story from discretionary trading to trend following trading to mean reversion trading, and then maybe back to trend following trading in what he's looking to do next. So this episode is going to be us kind of talking about what we've learned and some takeaways from that prior interview, which I thought was fantastic. So Dave, a market wizard, right? That was fantastic. That was a good get by you. I know you were the guy to reach out to get that going. I thought it was an amazing interview.
Yeah, I thought it was great. He's an awesome guy, and you could tell what struck me was just how humble he was.
Yeah.
He's had a lot of success, but you almost wouldn't know it just from hearing him talk.
Well, I think
So he's
that's
a great guy.
I think that's a good thing to talk about too, because that's pretty common, I think, when looking at real traders versus the kind of furus and finfluencers, which we did another interview on podcasts. If you're talking about how amazing you are all the time, then I think you've got to be a little bit worried, because I think real traders, it took us so long to kind of get where we are, and we're constantly always struggling to get better, that we realize that we've never there is no figuring it out, right? And you've never kind of hacked the system, so you're always kind of pushing from there. And I definitely heard that in him too, where he's like, oh yeah, I did okay sometimes. I'm like, no, you're a market wizard, right? It was what, 25% year over year growth for like 20 years. It was amazing. But yeah, very, very, very humble.
Yeah, totally. You're right. That is a pattern across good traders. So there were actually three things that stuck out at me about when I zoomed out and thought about what he told us about his career. And the first one, which I thought was brief, but I'm sure it's notable, and I'm sure he would say it's a notable part of his career, and that's when he developed this friendship with Gary B. Smith, who was the chart man at the time. I don't know if you remember him, Michael.
I think it was before my
He
time. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a pretty popular guy. He was on, CNBC, I think Fox Business. I think he even had a show on there.
Okay.
Um, I remember I interviewed him, at the time for a stock ticker interview, super nice guy. But I think, like we've said in the past, networking is a trading skill. And when you have the ability to connect with other people and have a little partnership, even if it's brief, that can have a huge impact on your trading.
Hmm.
And the fact that he did that then with somebody that was such a big name at the time tells me he is a networker
Yeah.
and really think and the big part of networking is thinking about what the other person needs, not thinking about what you want,
Hmm.
which is hard for a lot of people. So the fact that he did that, I bet, is a big part of the trajectory he ended up on. Like I said, it didn't last long, but it seemed to change the way he thought about things, and I'm sure he learned a lot from that.
Well, yeah, especially because he hadn't really had much interest in markets before then. To go with someone who was, um, I, technical in nature and kind of that well known, made a lot of sense, and probably helped that he didn't need to unlearn a lot of habits. It's not like he went to a fundamental guy first and spent a lot of time reading Warren Buffett's work or something like this, and then had to go technicals and then into quantitative. The fact that he jumped right into that technical world, which I always think leads to much more quantitative thinking anyway. Just it makes a lot of sense, and it was probably a really good and lucky get, to able to get someone who is technically minded, because back then, as a I haven't been around that long, but as someone who's been around for a long time, technicals are becoming more mainstream now, but especially back then were really, really shunned. I remember it wasn't really much. People weren't talking about charts as much as they are now, and all of that. So to find that in back then, I think probably did a really good setup for him to keep going.
Yeah, and the other so I always encourage traders to develop these partnerships
Hmm.
and, trading groups with other trusted people, and it takes time. I always I've got this roadmap product that it's a custom roadmap for people to, uh, get to from where they are to being successful trading, and I always put in a section in there for developing a trading partnership with others and a to-do list for how to do that. And one of the things I include in there is you for a good partnership to happen, you have to have some differences. You can't
Yeah.
be exactly similar to the other person. It sounds like this was a good partnership because you might remember how they sort of went their separate ways is Gary was a chart man. He was on TV
Hmm.
with the ability to read charts. So that was sort of orthogonal to the way Marston was going with, complete automation. So I think they had this partnership. They learned from each other. It went on for a certain amount of time. It ended, but I think they're both were better off as a result of it.
Well, and something, that we talk about a lot, that how much easier some aspects of trading has gotten over time. That's one that's it's got to be way easier now to get into groups and to learn and to mesh with traders now than it ever has been. We talked a little bit about social media and how not to use it, which is following other people's trades and falling for finfluencers. But I mentioned how to use social media, and for me, it's a lot of that. I share a lot of my thinking and analysis and everything on the markets. And what I find is you generally attract certain people that think, that are in that same kind of realm as you. So yeah, it's way easier to find chat rooms and forums and all of this. The problem is, like you mentioned trusted people, right? The problem is filtering that, but it's got to be way easier now than it was before. So, uh, what really struck me is that not a lot of people would have found someone that was that successful and traded a certain style and had the kind of reflection or wherewithal to say, it might work for you, but it's not going to work for me, and I'm going to go this different route. So I guess that's going to be the first time he kind of reinvented himself as a trader. So it's very interesting, and I think it gets to a really good lesson as well, where you don't want to be somebody who you end up joining a group and you end up saying, well, I have to trade like the people in that group. It's good to take that knowledge and then again reinvent yourself, and something that he did where he said, okay, well, the technical stuff doesn't really work for me as much. I'm going to go more quantitative, take what I learned from there, and then kind of apply it going forward. So that was very interesting to kind of break out of that mold and to do something different.
Yeah, totally. So the other takeaway number two was he spent 10 years at least 10 years creating basically trend following strategies.
Yep.
And it sounded like basically one or two big ideas. So if you think about that, um, you know, I get a lot of traders coming to me and they all, very a good number are bouncing between strategies. They trade something for a little bit, works for a little bit, stops working, they move on to
Yep.
something else. So it just struck me that here, the successful person, and it's no accident he was successful because he spent a decade on these two strategies, basically. So there's something to be said for that, just to dig in for a long time, think about it day in and day out, and dig deeper and deeper into one or two big ideas.
Well, and that's a whole nother podcast topic that we should go into. But the psychological phenomenons that make people jump around between strategies that much, and I think people underestimate the mental discipline required to stick to rules like that. I listened to an interview recently with Jerry Parker, who's one of the original turtle traders. And still going. And he talks about this all the time, that people think it's easy to do the same thing, even when there's going to be days or weeks or months in the case of longer term trading where that's not occurring. So yeah, the ability to do that, you say it 10 years, but to actually feel it, to go and do the same thing every single day for that long of period of time. One, the fact that there is no way that that always worked, right? That he had just this straight up equity curve. The ability to sit through drawdowns and sit through periods of time where, underperformance probably of the markets and all of that. Yeah, I just think you really have to give props to that mental discipline to be able to say, I'm going to continue to do the same thing again for 10 years before reinventing myself again, which we'll get to later. But I really do. I 100% agree that that was probably the key to his success is that you built something that worked and was simple that it worked, and you spend your time just going through the motions, which again people underestimate how hard that is. It's just, I'm going to place my trades, I'm going to capture my trades, I'm going to record and do all that, but I'm not going to just hop to the next strategy the second that something doesn't work, right? And I think that's the biggest plight of a lot of traders, right? They may have a good strategy that just doesn't do well for a month, and then all of a sudden they're off to trading crypto or options, or completely off what they were doing before, and probably at the worst time, probably right before the strategy starts to turn around again and do well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you can tell from somebody that trades a strategy that long that they have a path to confidence. It's easy to trade a strategy with a trivial amount of money when the money doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But to really scale up a strategy and trade it with meaningful amounts of money, you have to have a path to confidence, and that confidence comes from just experience trading it over and over. Uh, or and also it comes from back testing. So and all those are part of your process, and the better your process is, the better a path to confidence you have, and the bigger you can create a strategy. So
Yeah,
it's
because
to do it that long, you have to have that, because yeah, you're right. It's not going to be up and to the right that whole period. Uh, the way a lot of people think it probably is. Hey, he's an automated trader. He traded this for 10 years. It was just up and to the right. It sounds easy, right? But I know just from experience that's not the case.
well, and there was one question you asked that I liked, and kind of leads, I guess, to him having to reinvent himself again. Was talking about how you do something for 10 years, there's no way that you're not starting to get maybe overconfident a little bit with what is working there, right? You end up doing the same thing, and you're getting amazing results from it. It's the whole, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And you kind of asked and alluded to, and he agreed that should have probably spent some time and some energy when that was working looking for other things, because as we go down his kind of path here, what ended up happening was eventually those trend following systems just stopped performing well. He didn't make it seem like they entered in a massive drawdown and lost a lot of money. They just stopped doing anything, which in my experiences, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is that's generally what I find happens to a lot of trading strategies. They don't just all of a sudden you're making money and then they just completely fall apart. It ends up being this, the edge is gone, so your equity curve, instead of going up and tanking, it just goes up and then just moves sideways for a long period of time. It looks at what happened to him. So the one kind of takeaway I have for myself when I was listening to that is that if I end up finding something that ends up working beautifully for that long period of time, I need to always stay on my toes, looking ahead and building what I think will be the next thing, not knowing when I'll ever need it. Hopefully, maybe I never do, but having that in the back burner is super important.
Yeah. So there's two things that come to mind here. One is my favorite quote that I came up with, which is, the only thing harder than creating your first profitable trading strategy is creating your second profitable trading strategy.
Mhm.
And there's a good reason for that, because imagine trading something for 10 years. that's what you do. It becomes part of your identity.
Yeah.
It's who you are. And to give up on that is really hard. I mean, it's not you can't just do that overnight. You have to sort of plan for that and have, other strategies in place, but I can tell you, it's much easier when you have other strategies to fall back on. It's way easier to, uh, give up on the one strategy that's been paying the bills for a decade when you've got other ones that you've been working on and are scaling up. I mean, so, yeah, I went through this exact situation, about a decade ago, and it's just really hard. I was trading this one idea. Um, this strategy had worked really well for several years. You know, I bought a house with the profits from this strategy. I put a couple of my daughters through college. So this strategy meant a lot to me. So when it stopped working, when it tails off, that's really, really hard to deal with because you know you've had such history with it. And looking back, you know, I wish, like he mentioned, you know, I wish I would have worked on other strategies and had other ones ready to go earlier than I did.
Yeah. And that, we talked a little bit about Real Test, the software you create it, and that's one of the main reasons that I use it is that it does, it's built from the ground up to do this multi-strategy testing, right? Where you can always implement a new strategy and see how it affects and how it changes versus your other one. And I wonder if some of that was because of that lesson where he said, okay, I should have taken this existing strategy that I had, and then if I had implemented a new strategy in as well, that would have helped that transition because that seemed to be a bit of the hardest part, which kind of leads, I guess, to the next kind of reinventing that he did, where it was a 180. It was from trend following to mean reversion. There's no opposite sides for those who may be newer traders. Essentially, trend following just means I'm going to buy things that are going up and hope they continue to go up, and I'm going to sell things that are going down and hope they continue to go down. And mean reversion is the exact opposite. I'm going to buy things that are going down and hoping that I'm getting somewhere near the bottom and vice versa. And I just think, props to him, but that just seems like I could see someone going from, shorter term trend following to longer term trend following, or a different asset and trend, or a different method of trend following. But to take a kind of a clean sweep and a big 180 and just trade a completely different style seems, it must have been very mentally hard.
Yeah. There's a great quote here from Annie Duke, famous professional poker player. She doesn't play poker anymore, but
Yeah.
she was well known, and she's written a couple books. And this is from her book called Quit, which is a good book. The quote is this: "When your identity is what you do, then what you do becomes hard to abandon because it means quitting who you are."
Yeah.
So it's really, I totally resonated with that because I know he sort of glossed over, or he didn't allude to how difficult that time was making this huge adjustment and huge switch, but it had to be totally difficult because I've been through that before and it's miserable. It's really hard, and I'm sure he thought about quitting at that time,
Oh yeah.
rather than, you know, changing what he does. I just know he would have. So he kinda glossed over that, but that's really the hardest part of trading, having to reinvent yourself completely every few years, and that's definitely the hardest part, and, you know, a lot of people, uh, aren't cut out for it, but there's a lot of things you can do to prepare for that ahead of time. Um
Well, I think one thing that would make perfect sense is, we're talking about how, right, defining yourself, and then you have to kind of redefine yourself. And I remember learning this in business school way back in the day, that when you're creating a mission statement for a business, I'd make it, and it's probably the same if you're trading. You don't want to make the mission statement too narrow because then you box yourself in. So, for example, if you're looking at this now and you're saying, well, I'm a revision to the mean trader and I'm worried that, this reinvention may cause a lot of this kind of mental toll that Dave and Michael are talking about, and just define yourself as I am a systematic trader, right? And then from there, that broad definition ends up helping you do that, right? Because one thing that it made me think of when you were talking, Dave, is the whole we shared an article, or I shared an article with you that the NYSE is thinking of going almost 24/7 with its trading, and how that will affect people who are like, I'm a day trader versus I'm a swing trader. Those lines are going to slowly over time, over 5 or 10 years from now, I think are going to get very blurred. And if you're someone you're dogmatic about saying, I am this type of trader, again, I think that becomes problematic because, as someone like myself who trades crypto, there's no such thing as a day trader or a swing trader, right? It's just you trade. So I think that's one great way to do that is just to say, try not to define yourself too tightly into any one niche, and that may make letting go of that a little bit easier when the time comes.
Yeah, and it's sort of ironic that we started out this podcast saying, how it was awesome that he focused uh, so much on one strategy for 10 years,
Hmm.
and that's sort of an opposite to what you just suggested, which, just goes to show there's not one it's not gonna be an obvious answer when you're in these situations. You're gonna have to use your head, and you have to think about it for a long time. How am I too pigeonholed here? It's good to be pigeonholed at some points like he was for 10 years,
Hmm.
but also and as a parallel effort or an effort at the same time, doing something completely different, researching something completely different, broadening your horizon, but still, figuring out when to bore deep into a problem. It's really hard to figure out, but as you get more experience, your intuition starts telling you and suggesting what the right path is.
Well, I think you nailed it there, where it's in parallel, right? So as just again, the more I get into systematic trading, the more I try to think of, I'm someone who has kind of two hats, right? One hat is the trader side of me, which the more you get systematic trading takes less and less time and less energy and mental capital. And then there's the research side of things, which grows, right? If you're someone who's a discretionary trading, you're spending your entire time trading and looking at charts. If you're systematic, you're just waiting for the system to trade for you or an alert to come in or however you've offloaded that work. And I think you have to think of that as kind of two parallels, is that, you spend all of your trading time doing the thing that you know that works over and over again, the way Marsten did in the beginning with trend following. But then you have to open up another parallel pathway in which you're spending other mental capital that you're saving, not by discretionary trading all the time. And that has to be research and kind of exploration into new things. And I think that's going to be the best answer that you can ever come up with, is running those and making sure that you're not crossing from one to the other too quickly, where you research something and it sounds cool and it back tested great for a second, and then you're switching to trade it, but you have that kind of working in the background and ready to come in and replace, if and when you need to.
Yeah, so yeah, the more we talk and the more we do these podcasts, the more ideas I come up with for new podcast episodes. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. Um, the oh, oh, as you were talking there, one thing that it reminded me of that also struck me is there's a tendency for some systematic traders to spend all their time in backtest world. So they're always in the data. They're, looking at correlations, looking at equity curves, in their back tests. But really, a very uh, lucrative place and lucrative thing you could be doing instead of being in backtest world is to be looking at charts for all of these trades, because backtesting, as powerful as it is, it hides a lot of details that you can easily see in a chart just by going through, seeing what the trades were. One thing that I would suggest, if I was talking to Marston back in that 10-year period, I would say look at the charts for every trade that happens into your system, and imagine if you had to do the reverse. So, imagine you have had to trade the opposite direction of what your system's trading.
Mhm.
How would you even think about that? What sort of rules would you put in place to literally trade the opposite direction? And when you think about that, you should be familiar enough with your system and familiar enough with the charts from the trades that your system's taking that you should be able to identify the profitable areas for taking the opposite side. So that's one good way to come up with some new edge that is opposite of what you're doing, is to think about that, go through that thought exercise and think about that all the time. Look at trades that almost met your criteria but didn't, and figure out why. Is there some are there some of those trades you can include? And if they're not in there, maybe you could trade them the opposite direction. Like that's a useful thing to think about.
Yeah, and, as someone who's newer to the systematic side of things, I think that's what I enjoy the most, to be honest, is the more that I offload the trading to systems or alerts, and I spend less time staring at things. It's this what's next mentality. So I think people should look at that almost as play, for lack of a better term, especially if you have something that's working. You'll be very motivated if you're not making money to go and do this exercise of trying to find something that's working. But the way I do it is I kind of book off some time every single day to, and again, I consider it kind of very playful in nature, where I'm listening to podcasts or watching other people's trading styles, and I'm kind of trying to play and experiment with the what am I going to do next when and if this thing doesn't continue to work, and try not to think of it as something that you have to do. Try to think of it as you're exploring, right? Is the best way to do it, because most of the time you're not going to be end up doing anything with it, and it's not going to be something that does well. But every now and then you're going to hit something, and it may be a new strategy, or you may unlock something in a current strategy. So I think that's the one way to make sure that you don't have to do these hard switches that Marston had to do, is because if he had already been thinking about mean reversion and everything as well, and slowly implementing that into his system, then as his trend following systems dropped off, he would be assigning more and more capital to his mean reversion systems anyway, and just make these transitions, I think, a little bit smoother. And I'm sure if he was here looking back, that would be something he'd very much appreciate, is every time he had to do this change, if he had already been implementing something, it just makes it a way smoother transition, as opposed to, I'm going to stop trading and take 6 months off and think about it and then start trading again. If it's, I'm just going to apply a little bit more capital to strategy A and a little bit less capital to strategy B, again, you're less of a binary switch and more of a gradient.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always good to be planning ahead, thinking about how you can improve the strategies you're trading, even if they're doing great. How can you make more money with them? How could you make them more profitable? How could you make more trades with them?
Hmm.
Because it's not only when the strategy quote unquote stops working that you have to change. Sometimes the market changes the rules, like literally the architecture of the market has changed, which totally gets rid of an edge. I've
Hmm.
had that happen to me, like, overnight, something stopped working. It's really rare that that happens. Usually, it's a much harder situation to recognize. Usually, profitable strategies going up and to the right, and then maybe it fades a little bit. Maybe it's not quite as profitable. Maybe the time between drawdowns is a little less. Maybe the drawdowns are a little bit steeper, but maybe the back test still looks really, really good. And that's there. You're not going to be in a situation where like it all of a sudden just goes completely flat or
Yeah.
completely down. So you're always going to be in the situation where you're like, man, is this just another little drawdown? Is this right before it picks back up again? Is it broken? Like you're never going to be able to tell that definitively, and there's not going to be you can't go to the and they'll give you the right answer because it's just unknowable. It's really hard.
It is, and I think what we've kind of both agreed on and landed on is that, a lot of people talk about diversification as diversification across assets. It seems like diversification across strategies seems to make more sense. And to, uh, and this is what I really like when we do stuff like this that dispels the systematic or automatic trader being the guy who lets a robot completely runs for him and then just goes on the beach and drinks Mai Tais, because that would work. If you have a strategy that works, you could in theory do that and it'll work for a while, but eventually at some point, right, that strategy is going to have some sort of a problem and you're going to be kicking yourself saying, well, I should have been, working, and I should have been in the office, and I should have been preparing for what would happen when this occurs by building another strategy or coming up with some refinements in the wings that could happen. So it just really helps us kind of push towards this as well. So the last reinvention that it was awesome, because I didn't know this until we were interviewing with him, that he talked about is his plan to do it again. And he's what do you say, 65 at the time, and he's planning on doing the whole thing again, where he's thinking trend following for futures and then mean reversion for stocks, and testing those strategies as well. And it seemed like something that he was interested in expanding out of, and I thought that was really cool, because how many 65-year-olds do you know that are willing to say, okay, well, I'm going to completely change the way I do things? It just shows that whenever, as long as you have the data, you can test it, then try new things, right?
Yeah, and it's important to have your own process that you're constantly improving to be able to do that, like your own backtesting process, your own uh, process for evaluating strategies, your process for looking at the market that doesn't rely on anybody else. You don't want to have to rely on somebody else to, happen to be in their trading room that day and tell you what to do.
Yep.
It's much more powerful. You're going to be in the game a lot longer the more you work on your workflow and your process for improving everything about what you do.
Absolutely. So that was an amazing interview. I know we have some more interviews already on the docket, and we're gonna look to do more of those as well, and hopefully we'll be getting better at doing these interviews, which I think we're already off to a great start there. Um, is there any other takeaways that we're missing on again, the honor, I think, to talk to a market wizard is fantastic, and all of the different things that we can learn from them, because it's one of those that we don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to trading. We just need to find the people who have been doing that with some success, and then grabbing on. So is there anything we're missing here, Dave?
Um, I I just sort of reiterate what we said at the very beginning, which was how open and humble he was.
Hmm.
Very open about, he didn't say, "Hey, I had all these great years. I never had any drawdowns. Life was great." He went into detail about the actual changes he had to make, the drawdowns he had, the reasons that, he had to change. So I just loved everything about that interview.
Absolutely. And yeah, we're looking forward to the next one. We won't spoil it here, but we do have another one already on the books, and we'll be expanding out from there. So, listen, thank you all for tuning in. As always, we're loving, everything that's happening with this. I looking forward to recording these every time. So again, I appreciate everyone coming out and giving a listen. And I am Michael Noss.
I'm Dave Mabe, and we'll see you next week on Line Your Own Pockets.